Welcome to the Modern Software Engineering channel, and thanks for being here. If you're enjoying the content, hit subscribe and like, the usual YouTube things. Today, we're going to be looking at answering the question, should software developers care about software architecture? And with me, Sam Newman, new to the channel, new presenter on the channel, to help us answer this fascinating question. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
It's great to see you. So, the question, should software developers care about software architecture?
Yes. I think we can end it there, right? I mean, that's a nice, quick, short video. I mean, I think we both agree that the answer is yes. And then the question then is probably like how far do you go with that? I feel if you think a developer shouldn't care about the architecture. So if you think the answer is no, well, then I think we're back in the bad old days of a developer being told exactly what to do so that they don't violate some architecture that they're unaware of, right? So we're back to, I'm the big brain in the ivory tower. Here is my architecture. You do exactly what I tell you. And well, kind of those days I think are mostly gone. So developers have to be more aware of the software architecture, I think, to do a good job. The question then becomes is, how much do they need to be aware of when it comes to the architecture?
And that is a tricky question. I agree that's an important characteristic of this decision, but it's kind of a tricky question to answer because certainly I see code, design and architecture as part of a continuum. There's no hard line between those different things. Where code stops and design begins, I can't tell you, because to me code is all about design and vice versa. And where design stops and architecture begins, I can't tell you that either, except at some extreme, architecture is about the more common patterns that we want to establish to keep us on track. But they're common patterns in design. So
I think you describing it as a continuum, I think, is a really interesting way of doing it, because I think you're right. Those lines are a bit fuzzy. Yeah. So you could pick points in that line and say, okay, well, that point, someone's just writing a piece of code. At this point, somebody's thinking about a multi-country, multi-region failover architecture. They're different things at different, and you definitely say those are different things with different amounts of skills involved. Yeah. But you kind of get there quite gradually. So
yes,
that's kind of useful, right? In a way, though, that when we start thinking about how far up that spectrum do you want to go and where are you engaged actively?
Yeah.
And so I think the thing I've trying to be thinking about is so if you're somebody responsible for the architecture of a system, you're spending most of your time thinking about that architecture, understanding the forces acting upon it, making sure the architecture is fit for purpose for your business stakeholders, for the developers working on the systems, for everything else that's going on. That's your full-time job.
Yeah.
You can't expect a developer to have that same degree of understanding, right? So the question then becomes is how much do they need to be aware of this, and how do you give them enough to do their job well, I guess, is kind of a bit of an open question.
Yeah, and an important one. My pragmatic approach to this question is my preference is to involve developers in architectural decision making. The problem is I agree with you entirely about the spectrum, and certainly from the outside and probably from the inside too, to some extent, the very different characteristics of choices at one end of the spectrum from the other end of the spectrum. But a choice at one end of that spectrum, either end, can have serious implications for the other end. So I can make a change in code that invalidates architectural decisions.
Yeah.
And I can make a change in architecture that prevents code being written in any sensible way.
I think part of the other challenge with all this is about scale as well. So if you're a 10-person team or 20-person team even, right, you can have everybody involved in all decisions, or at least those who want to be interested, right? Because ultimately there's a difference between people who are interested and people that are accountable, right? There are different degrees here, right?
Yeah.
So, but in a 20-person team, right, you might be the architect accountable for the architecture. You could throw open and say, everyone, feel free to get involved. And that could kind of work, right? But if you're in a situation where you've got 200 or 1,000 people involved in building the systems, it is not feasible for everybody to be involved in every conversation and decision. So you sort of have to, and that's partly why you need to find ways to sort of chunk things up a little bit. And to also, though, maybe have in those larger systems to have clear understanding about who's kind of responsible and accountable for different parts of that decision making, right? So I sort of feel that the line for me is often like, I would like a developer to be aware of the parts of the architecture where they can actually reasonably have an impact. So if if my team owns a small cog, we can have an impact. We can own that whole cog. That whole cog is ours, right? That's our cog, right? We can't necessarily we're not in a position to affect the entire machinery. So being aware of that, by all means, if you want to be aware of that, and it's good to be aware of your wider context, but you're not necessarily going to be able to meaningfully change that wider machine, but you can change your part. So that's sort of maybe the line a little bit, is like, for the larger teams, larger organizations, is like, you need to know your space well, because that's where you have impact.
I think that's those two ideas, the scope of the impact, and the idea of doing things at large scale are, we're talking about the same thing. And one of the things that I came pragmatically to the conclusion is that when we're talking about things like organizational structures and decomposition, it's almost exactly the same problem as software structures and decomposition. It's kind of an architectural question. It's about coupling and modularity and cohesion and separation of concerns and all of those things, but applied at the organizational level. Fundamentally, you want people to be capable of understanding the things that are in their scope and make decisions about them without forcing too much change in other parts of the organization where you can avoid that. So ideally, you want to compartmentalize big systems and allow people realistic freedoms of doing things. And as you say, one of the techniques for that is to chunk up. So modularity and then chunk up. So you can kind of raise the level of abstraction to kind of deal with bigger bits of the problem. And that's part of architectural thinking, it seems to me. So at the level at which developers need to care about that, at the minimum, they need to understand their place in the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Even if they're a bit vague and fuzzy about what's going on in other places in the bigger picture. So you need a kind of abstract level picture of the overall thing that everybody shares, it seems to me.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of thoughts. So the first is, I think there's the bare minimum you need to know to do your job well, right? I need enough understanding of my architecture to be able to make good decisions. That's bare minimum. And then there's, do I have an environment in which I can learn more if I want to, if I'm curious? I think that's really important. That's also how you grow skills and you see people step up. But that understanding of the context and the forces acting on you, I think, is really valuable. So like if you look at, say, like in the Simon Brown C4 diagrams, that context view is really useful for that, right? This is your cog. Here's the things around your cog. And I think everybody should understand those bits. Like if you're just creating a service that's being used as part of a larger system, you should know who your consumers are, or the producers that you rely on, or the consumers that you support, but also, are there different stakeholder groups of end users that you're suiting? Having that picture, and everyone having that picture, I think, is really quite important. And so that, and I don't think that's an onerous task to do or communicate, right? I think it's about will.
The other thing is as we chunk up and we get to those bigger scales, it seems to me that we must become more abstract. So I have a slightly different concept of the kind of context picture to Simon when he talks about that, and I talk in terms of tourist maps. What I want for my system at whatever scale is, I'd kind of like a tourist map, so that we can kind of figure out where the gorillas are and we can figure out where the crocodiles are. Or even though the map isn't geographically accurate and has pretty pictures of crocodiles and gorillas on it, it's the kind of map that is a useful tool, but isn't an accurate, it's an accurate representation of reality, but it's not a precise representation. And that seems really valuable, because now stuff can change without invalidating the map.
I think there's also, like, how broadly you need to share knowledge of the architecture also becomes an interesting question generally. And this is for me where it kind of gets wrapped up a bit with like the cost of change stuff.
Yeah.
I got asked a question recently is how should organizations enforce API consistency? And to which I said they shouldn't.
Yeah.
And apparently that was a controversial view. And my point was, and this goes for any architectural change, is like not all change is the same, right? So if you've got something that has a low cost of change,
Yeah.
and the impact of making that change if you get it wrong is really low,
Yeah.
it's easy to make the change. Well, the amount of ceremony or oversight you need is really low, right? Just try it out. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, you can fix it. So in that context, you probably only need a small number of people involved in the conversation, discussion. They can handle it themselves, get on with their lives. If you're creating or making a change which has a much bigger impact, has a higher cost of change, and has a much higher cost if you get it wrong, in that, so like an API that everybody has to use as a simplistic example, in that environment, getting it wrong is so costly that actually, A, you should take time over that decision, and B, you should probably involve a lot more people in having the conversation, having the discussion. So I think even when it comes to thinking about our software architecture, it's like there's an element of that in it as well. It's like, how much of this do I need to let people know about or be involved with? I think that there's I haven't quite kind of sort of made these two models kind of mesh necessarily in my head, but I'm trying somehow.
This episode is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant helps you to become a better thinker and problem solver with thousands of visual interactive lessons in maths, science, programming, data analysis, and artificial intelligence. I am a self-professed nerd and love learning new things, and I've been a Brilliant subscriber for some time now, indulging my love of maths, physics, and science in general. I've particularly enjoyed courses on scientific thinking, geometric thinking, digital circuits, and I'm on my way to learning about quantum computing. Brilliant is a more effective way to learn because it makes your engagement with the topic interactive and so much more engaging, and I think builds a more intuitive understanding of the subject that you're studying. I use Brilliant for a few minutes every day, completing a few lessons on my phone. To learn free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/modern software engineering. You can scan this QR code or click on the link in the description below. Brilliant has given our viewers 20% off their annual subscription price, so do check it out. This gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. Thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this episode, and now back to Sam and I violently agreeing about software architecture. So another quote that I can't properly remember is somebody said something about a good architecture has few constraints but strongly held. So you want a few rules. You don't want it to be hugely complicated. You want it to be understandable by large proportions of people. Ideally, everybody in the development team needs some sense of this. But you don't want people, you want the rules to be pretty solid so that people can't wander outside it, because then they're going to start breaking stuff, because these are the rules that the assumptions are built on. And that's really tricky to get, but that seems important.
And I've found the value in some circumstances of separating out the constraint and the principle sometimes, because the constraints tend to be things we just don't have much choice over. We stuck with this, we have to do this. Whereas the principles of things, this is how we're going to go about doing things. But there could be a bit of discussion about, are these still the right principles? And so like the way we go about solving the problems given those constraints, that's something I want people to have an understanding of. And I think you're right that needs to be a short list, a small list. I also like to be able to answer the question sometimes why. And again, for those more curious, so that the architecture we come up with is a product of the context we operate in. So it is a context of the people we have, the skills those people have, the regulations that we have to follow, the laws we have to follow, the needs of our customers, the needs of the business or the organization we're working for. There's all a huge array of context that goes into coming up with an architecture. And architects spend all their time thinking about that stuff.
Yeah.
So as a developer who wants to be much more curious, understand why decisions are made,
Yeah.
you're not just communicating or helping them understand the architecture, but also helping them understand the whys around it. And often when I find that developers get frustrated by an architecture, it's because they don't get to see behind the curtain. They don't get to see that wider context. I think most of the frustrating conversations I've had with developers around this stuff have been where they don't like a decision that's been made, and when you try and explain the context, they don't want to listen to the context. And if they don't want to listen to the context, then at that point, yeah, you shut up and do what you're told.
Yeah.
Those people that want to know the context, they're going to spend the time with, because you sort of have to understand that the architecture is a product, and also recognize that the architecture is not the only potential good answer to the context. There might be loads of other good architectures that we could come up with, right?
Yeah, but you've got to agree one. Otherwise, you end up with the default architecture, a big ball of mud.
Yeah, which is sort of the accidental architecture, right? It's like always have an architecture. The question is, was it one that you had? Did you have any say in it, or did it just happen?
The architecture happened to you rather than you happening to it.
Yes, I think both of us have worked on systems where we felt like the architecture was happening to us.
Oh yes, yeah.
So I think, okay, so let's just do a bit of a quick recap. So we think they need to know there's something about even knowing where architecture even starts on that continuum.
Yeah.
And I think you've pointed out, I think as well, that there's, you absolutely want to throw that net as wide as possible for the people that are interested.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really valid part, right? And I think that, there's the bare minimum that you want that everyone needs to know and understand.
Yeah. Just to add to that, that's a pragmatic thing. That's not just about being nice to people. That's pragmatic because they might spot a hole or be fighting something that you need to correct, that you need to
100%.
You see the flaws in the architecture at the point at which you're trying to execute on it.
Absolutely. I think that's a really valid point. I'm a big fan of the concept of habitability, right? And that was really talked about context-wise. That if you are an architect, you have a duty responsibility to the people that live in that system, right?
Yes.
So if they're not kind of aware of the architecture, you're not going to get the right feedback about whether or not the architecture is doing right by them. And yes, I know and I understand that you should also be coding architects if you can, but don't kid yourself that as a coding architect, you have anything like as much awareness of the code as the people spending all their time in it.
Yes.
So there has to be, if they're aware of the architecture and what you're trying to achieve and why, when they hit those things, they're much more likely to come and have a conversation.
Yeah.
Whereas if they're not aware of the architecture, what can happen is they hit a problem caused by the architecture, and then they just find inventive ways to circumvent it without understanding the implications of that.
Yes.
The classic one being when trying to impose like modular structures to try and bring some structure to the system, and finding some developers just gone in and changed a whole lot of packages to being public so they can bypass encapsulation and break all of your system boundaries. It's like, well, they were there for a reason. We should have a conversation about that, right? I know there's a book by George Fairbanks, and I can't remember the name of this book. Actually, I think he's only written one. And he talks about this concept of having an architecturally evident coding style, which is writing code in such a way that the architecture is more obvious. And that is useful from 2 points of view. One, because as a developer, you're kind of aware of what's going on. But also back to your point, it's about allowing that architecture as a snapshot. If the code represents that architecture more closely, your snapshot is more likely to be up to date. So I think there's also some interesting ideas in that, which is, can we help developers see or experience the architecture by making that architecture more explicit in the code they're working on?
Yes. I really love that idea. I hadn't come across that before, but I'm going to steal that idea. Architecturally evident coding style. That's absolutely at the core of what I think is the right way to go about things.
The book I've just looked up is called Just Enough Software Architecture. So I worked on, George and I were both at Google at the same time a bit. Yeah. I met him at a Saturn conference, I think we were in 2016 in Boston. and I was there doing some discussions on DevOps. Simon Brown was there. We did like a panel on microservices being a bad idea. It was a bit of fun. We ended up being curfewed and stuck in the hotel because there was riots going on in the city at the time. It was in Baltimore. We're in Baltimore. Had a fun time. So yeah, the book's called Just Enough Software Architecture. And I remember reading it at the time, and George is a lovely guy. I haven't spoken to him in years, so I don't know what he's up to now, but he has some interesting ideas.
Cool. We'll put a link in the description.
Yeah. But yeah, that was kind of cool. And that is the thing. I mean, we've danced around this a bit. There is so many smart people out there who are sort of sitting down to try and work out what software architecture is. And I read all of them. Like I read stuff by George or Simon or Grady or yourself or, Ruth Milan or whatever. And it's all, this makes absolute sense to me about what this is. But can it all be true? That's why I still struggle. That's why we pushed off this question about what software architecture is just for a little bit longer, I think.
So to summarize our summary, because I interrupted your summary. So the answer is yes, people should care, but also that it's complicated.
So I think the things that criticize me is the stuff they need to know to do their jobs well, and that's bare minimum. And I think
that shouldn't be complicated.
That shouldn't be complicated. I think you put it really well. They should understand the constraints. They should understand the context. They should probably understand the architecture over which they can have impact, right? Yeah. But I think, to your point earlier, we also need to create space where those people are curious and want to know more, can go and find out more and be involved, ideally be involved in the decision making as well.
That's probably more of a team culture thing than anything else, of just growing the team's capability that way and growing the sense of responsibility for those sorts of changes, because it's so risky to isolate the decision making and assume that the architecture is right and so it's absolutely fixed, or assume that the architecture is wrong and we might as well just ignore it. Both of those are bad ideas.
I think that's why that's why I say is that, like, you are responsible for the architecture. You're not necessarily the person who has to create or come up or define what it should be, right? You're the person on the hook if the architecture turns out to be completely inappropriate, but you might have loads of people helping you with it, right?
Yeah. It's the phrase that I really like from Ralph Johnson's definition is the shared understanding. That's why it's shared. It's the understanding that we all kind of subscribe to some degree.
Yeah. I think that's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think that's probably our time is up. Thanks very much indeed, Sam, for taking part. Looking forward to seeing more of you on the channel. Thanks everybody for watching. And as I said at the start, if you haven't already, do subscribe to the channel. And if you enjoyed the content, me and Sam talking about architecture today, hit like. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.